Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of Al-Shabaka's Policy Lab series. My name is Nadim Bawalsa. I am the commissioning editor at Al-Shabaka. Thank you for joining us for this very important discussion about the Israeli regime's policies and mechanisms of demographic engineering across colonized Palestine. Since its creation in 1948, the Israeli state has been implementing laws and policies to ethnically cleanse colonized Palestine of Palestinians and to keep those it exiled in exile. In addition to forcibly expelling them from the land, it continues to legally classify Palestinians in Palestine and in exile differently as a way of perpetuating their fragmentation and facilitating their permanent distancing from the land. Whether through denying refugees their right of return, revoking Palestinian Jerusalemites' residency rights, denaturalizing Palestinian citizens of Israel for so-called breaches of loyalty, or banning family unification across the Green Line and beyond, Israel continues to implement its apartheid policies against Palestinians with impunity. Today, and with the new Israeli government regime in place, these policies seem more blatant than ever. How exactly has Israel engineered and implemented these policies over the decades? What are their different implications for the fragmented Palestinian people, and how can they be challenged? To answer these questions and more, I am joined by Nada Awad and Rabea Eghbariah. Nada Awad is a Shabaka policy analyst who works as the Human Rights Council Advocacy Coordinator at the International Service for Human Rights. She holds a master's degree in international relations and international security from Sciences Po, Paris. Previously, Nada worked on human rights violations in the Middle East and North Africa region as the International Advocacy Officer at the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies. In Palestine, she was responsible for the advocacy unit at Al-Quds University's Community Action Center, where she focused on the issue of forcible transfer of Palestinians from Jerusalem. Nada also co-authored the critical report titled Israeli Apartheid, Tool of Zionist Settler Colonialism, published by Al-Haq in 2022. Rabea Eghbariah is also a policy analyst at Al-Shabaka, and he is an attorney completing his doctoral studies at Harvard Law School. He works as a public defender and later joined the Haifa-based Adala Legal Center, where he continues to argue Palestinian civil and political rights cases in Israeli courts. Rabea published on various subjects relating to Palestinians and Israeli law, including the censorship of online speech, the legal land regime, and the criminalization of Palestinian foragers. His writings appeared in the Yale Journal of Law and Technology, the Law and Political Economy Project, and the Journal of Palestine Studies, among others. Thank you both very much for joining us in this important and timely discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to inform our viewers of the format of tonight's Policy Lab. For the first 30 minutes or so, I'll pose some questions to both Nada and Rabea. During the second half of the lab, they'll answer questions directly from you. Throughout the discussion, please submit your questions by clicking on the Ask a Question button that is below at the bottom of your screens. And remember, you can vote on the questions you'd like asked. If possible, please direct your question to one of our speakers. I'll do my best to address as many of your questions as possible. So let's begin. Nada, let's start with you. You've worked extensively on residency revocation cases in Jerusalem, including the recent forcible transfer of Salah Hamouri, the Palestinian Jerusalemite and human rights lawyer who was deported to France. In fact, there have been over 14,000 residency revocation cases since 1967 in Jerusalem, and they are on the rise. How do policies like these reflect the Israeli regime's broader strategies for demographic engineering across colonized Palestine?
Thank you for organizing this timely discussion. I would like to start by saying that we cannot address Jerusalem without addressing fragmentation. And this is one of the key points that was discussed in the report that you mentioned, published by Al-Haq, about apartheid. And Jerusalem is one of the examples of how Israel has utilized tools to change the demography of a city, but it has done so in the context of its Israeli apartheid regime, which was established following the Nakba of 48. So it comes within a context, and we cannot dissociate it from this context of fragmentation of the Palestinian people. So just as context, we need to remember that Israel has fragmented the Palestinian people into at least 4 categories, whether it's through the legal fragmentation, geographic fragmentation, to ensure that Palestinians cannot meet, group, and live together and exercise their collective rights, most importantly, their right to self-determination. So Palestinians in Jerusalem are one of these categories that has been severed from its natural habitat, from the rest of the West Bank, from Palestinians, refugees who are denied the right to return, etc. So this is one of the first policies that Israel has used to establish its apartheid regime and then to maintain it by not allowing Palestinians to group and resist collectively this apartheid regime. So following this fragmentation, from this point about Palestinians in Jerusalem being isolated from their natural surrounding, by the wall, by checkpoints, by the fact that Palestinians cannot exercise their culture, etc. There is, since the occupation of Jerusalem in 1967, of the eastern part of Jerusalem, the establishment of policies and practices that were, since the beginning, established against the Palestinians as in 1948, but Israel took these policies and laws and these practices that established apartheid and extended them to the occupied East Jerusalem. In this sense, Israel started with learning from a mistake it has done by providing citizenship to Palestinians in 1948 by thinking they will want to annex the land without giving citizenship to the Palestinians. So Palestinians in 1967 were provided a precarious residency status called a residency. It's called permanent residency, but it's an oxymoron because this residency has been revoked based on more and more easily revoked criteria. So since 1967, Israel has been revoking the residency rights of Palestinians. But at the beginning, it was if a person leaves Jerusalem for over 7 years, if the person gets citizenship or gets a different nationality elsewhere. However, in 1995, Israel introduced a new criteria, which is the center of life criteria. This center of life criteria was introduced after a very emblematic case of the wife of Fathi Shiqaqi, who was one of the founders of the Islamic Jihad, who was deported to Syria. So she came back to register her children and to renew her ID before the expiration of the time that was provided until now by the policy of residency revocation. However, when she came back from Syria, they told her, well, no, the Ministry of Interior said, your residency is revoked because your center of life is not Jerusalem. So this shows how the policies are first started with cases that are emblematic, that are shown to the international community as dangerous, as Islamist, as etc. So this, after the revocation of their residency and the introduction of the Center of Life policy in 1995, we can see that 11,500 residencies were revoked until today. And since 1967 until today, it's more than 14,500, sorry. So we can see that the most important residency revocation comes after the Center of Life policy was introduced by Israel. And it shows how it is starting to shift towards a more intense residency revocation. But after the introduction of the Center of Life policy, we have a new policy that was introduced, again, using emblematic cases. The case of 3 parliamentarians from Hamas who were elected from Jerusalem, and the previous minister of Jerusalem who was also belonging to Hamas. So following their revocation of their residency by the Minister of the Interior at the time in 2006, there was a big issue because they went to the court to say the Minister of the Interior does not have the prerogative to revoke our residency based on the breach of allegiance criteria. This is not allowed by law. However, at the time, the court ruling did not come. Only after 11 years did the court rule and say the Minister of the Interior does not have this prerogative to revoke the residency of Palestinians of Jerusalem based on breach of allegiance. However, they provided the parliament the time, 6 months, to change the law, to amend the law. And this is what happened with the amendment number 30 in March 2018, when the parliament amended the law, allowing for the minister to have this prerogative to revoke residencies based on breach of allegiance. And again, we see how Israel uses precedent-setting cases. And since then, we see that the laws are preceded by cases, are preceded by practice. And it's not the fact that we have laws that is problematic, because these have been ongoing for years before there was actually a law. And today we see more and more the use of cases where Israel claims its security laws or deterrence to advance the transfer of Palestinians, to advance these laws. And the most recent laws in bills today in the Knesset are seen as very dangerous and new, but in fact, since for a long time, there has been always new bills and new laws. After the 2015 uprising, also there were new bills at the time that called for the revocation of the residency of family members of attackers, between brackets, but these also are not new, and these also are not unprecedented, because the families of alleged attackers have had their residencies revoked. And we have seen in Jerusalem the case of Manwa Kumbar, the mother of one of these alleged attackers, who was killed, but his mother had her residency revoked, while another 10 members of the extended family had their family unification revoked. So what we see here is that Israel is using these cases to set precedents and then to establish new laws with the purpose of changing the demography of Jerusalem. The case of Salah Hammouri is not new. Deportation is not new. Salah Hammouri, there are dozens of cases of deportations that happened before that, but the fact that Salah, a human rights defender who has been working and mobilizing against the apartheid regime, this law has been used against him, shows that it will open the way to normalize this policy and this practice and this using this law against Palestinians in Jerusalem in a very widespread manner. And thus we have been talking about and trying to raise alarm around. But again, this is a case that we are sure now will open the way for further transfer.
Thank you very much, Nada, for this very thorough and contextualization of what is taking place, but also how it's part and parcel of a strategy that has been in the works for decades. To the extent that East Jerusalem and the West, as part of the West Bank, is an occupied city, it's important to also contextualize what's happening in 1948 territories, because something similar, but maybe in a different guise, is taking place there. So Rabea, let's on that note, let's move on to you. You've worked extensively within the Israeli court system to protect the rights of Palestinian citizens of Israel to their nationality and citizenship rights, including the right of family unification, known as Lam Shamil. How do these policies fit into the Israeli strategy of demographic engineering? I mean, after all, these are citizens. These Palestinians are citizens of Israel. So let's try to contextualize what's happening there within this broader strategy as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for organizing this. I'm really happy to be here. And thank you, Nada, for this wonderful framing and opening. And I really appreciate actually you led with the framework of fragmentation, and I just saw in the chat that people had questions about that. So I'll reiterate perhaps this point, because it has to do with what we're talking about, right? It has to do with what we mean when we say demographic engineering, and I want to maybe say a word about that. But basically, I saw a question in the chat saying, you mentioned 4 categories of fragmentation. What are they? So I'll take the chance to reiterate that Israel, again, classifies or maintains a system that classifies and stratifies Palestinians legally into different legal statuses, and distributes basically different identity cards based on metrics of mainly territory, but not only territory. And it can be starting from a Palestinian citizen of Israel, which is one category, a resident of Jerusalem, which is another category. It's important, of course, to note that these are only categories for Palestinians. They do not apply to Jewish Israelis who enjoy a superior unified legal status. And Nada, obviously, in her intervention, just detailed the policies pertaining to particularly Palestinians residents of East Jerusalem, which again enjoy a different legal status from citizenship. For example, they cannot vote, they do not participate in the electoral process, and their residency is subject to revocation much easier than a citizenship. A third category is residents of the West Bank. A fourth is Gaza, and I want to go back to this to say that Gaza is part of the story of demographic engineering. And a fifth perhaps could be refugees, or people who are excluded from the regime, right? They are defined by their exclusion from the regime, or the direct rule of Israel proper. Now, so this is the framing we're talking about, and I think it is important to understand in what sense Israel is doing demographic engineering in this context, right? We have about 7 million Palestinians and 7 million Jewish Israelis living in between the territory of historical Palestine, between the river and the sea today. But again, because of this system of legal fragmentation, and because of the idea of a Jewish state, right? The Zionist idea of a Jewish state rests on the basic idea that Jewish people have to be majority in this state, or in the population that is considered citizenship, right? In this class of people. And Palestinian citizens constitute somewhat a problem or complicate this situation, not to speak of Palestinians in Jerusalem and in the West Bank, that if potentially included in this fabric or this legal construct, the idea of a Jewish state will not be viable anymore, because a majority will not be maintained. So Israel is in fact necessitated from its point of view to continuously construct this legal regime of Jewish superiority or Jewish supremacy and demographic engineering. And this includes, again, I want to say that, for example, so-called disengagement from Gaza. Because Gaza is really important also to center as not an anomaly of this story. It is part of the story of calculating risks, perhaps demographically, and realizing, what, maybe we can give up on this in return of some sort of, demographic stability. And it was actually very clear in the incentives of the plan to disengage from Gaza that demography played a major part in that story. There were talks about, the birth rate of Palestinians in Gaza, and the viability of maintaining a Jewish population in that area was also, part of the story. But in any case, but by doing so, or by creating a Gaza class, which is distinct suddenly from the designation of West Bank, Israel is again perfecting its regime of not only legal fragmentation, but also demographic engineering, because it's managing a population and it is trying to basically decrease the number of Palestinians it directly classifies as it considers as its ruling, right? Because it does not even recognize its occupation or its obligations under international law vis-a-vis Gaza. Now, going back to the citizenship class, which I guess I'm here to talk about, it is important to maybe, Nadim, you just led with a question. After all, they're Palestinian citizens of Israel. This is exactly the point. Palestinian citizens of Israel are not given this privilege by as a gift, right? This, if we want to contextualize how this all started, Palestinian citizens of Israel in 1948 are the people who somehow managed to stay in what later became suddenly Israel, and they got the citizenship, they hold Israeli citizenship, but they were subjected to 19 years of military rule, right? From 1948 to 1966. This is not a regular type of citizenship. In fact, it is a colonial citizenship, if you wish, or a second-tier citizenship, you name it, right? And the policies from the military rule era, or the military regime that used to govern Palestinian citizens of Israel, still, did not disappear. They just mutated and changed over time. And I think the clearest manifestation of it was in 2021, in May, the uprising of the what's usually called the Unity Intifada showed that people with Palestinian citizens of Israel as still, the militaristic apparatus of the state once needed was unleashed on Palestinian citizens. You had considerations to deploy military in places like Led and elsewhere. So it is clear that Palestinian citizens are not ruled by, by distinctive. Let me rephrase. They are definitely granted certain privileges because of this citizenship, but this does not mean that they are not targeted by these demographic engineering policies. And family unification is a clear manifestation of this regime that basically, again, for those of you in the audience who don't know what is the family unification, it's a law that was first enacted in 2003 that basically bars Palestinian citizens or residents of Jerusalem from extending their legal status to their partners from the West Bank, Gaza, potentially also refugees and people from Lebanon and certain other areas, right? But most importantly, for people from the West Bank or Gaza. And basically, this is a way to not only discourage or ban effectively the marriages of inter-Palestinian marriages. In fact, it's creating a legal environment that makes it really impossible to maintain family life as a Palestinian citizen or resident without needing to move to the West Bank, right? And if, for example, a Palestinian resident, unlike a citizen, moves to the West Bank, the center of life, what Nada was just talking about, the center of life category becomes relevant because moving to the West Bank may lead to residency revocation. So we're talking about an ecosystem, right? We're talking about this whole different legal categories that suddenly are at play and interact one with the other. And it's actually a very complex legal system if we want to go into the details. Because this is part of the story, that the legal system is not made easy to navigate, partly also to create this to obscure how it works, right? To obscure the intent to dominate, to obscure the intent to engineer the population. So you'll have suddenly a class of citizens that functions slightly different from a class of residents, and these whole systems are interacting with each other, reinforcing each other, which is, again, by the end of the day, the final line is, or the organizing logic of all of this is maintaining a Jewish majority and minimizing the number of Palestinians with citizenship, with residency, that are in Jerusalem in particular. So the family unification had few iterations, and I'm happy to expand in the Q&A about that if any of you are interested. It started in 2003. The law has been reenacted as a temporary measure each year, extended each year. In 2020, basically, the law expired because of disagreement within the Israeli government. Back at the time, they had this crisis in forming a government and unity government with the rise of Bennett. And basically, after it was renewed, we resubmitted the petition to try to challenge this law. Interestingly, in between, 20 years have passed that solidified or crystallized the demographic intent of this law, with many different senior public ministers, prime ministers, almost everybody in the Israeli legal system or the Israeli politics have declared the intent of this law being a tool to preserve Jewish majority and demography, not the so-called security concern that they previously claimed in court, and that the court adopted as a justification to make to rule this law as legal. Now it's going to be interesting. Well, obviously, we do not expect the Supreme Court to be, the guardian of Palestinian rights. In fact, it has infamous record of violating and conducting the violation of Palestinian rights. But it's going to be interesting to see how, and this is a pending case, how the court is going to deal with its own previous judgments, saying that basically this law is needed for security reasons, when it's now obvious that this is a law motivated by demographic engineering. I will just add a word before saying that, and I'm happy to expand perhaps in the next section, about policies to revoke citizenship, not only residency, which is a new kind of trend that the Supreme Court also legalized or upheld a law last year in 2021. It delivered a major ruling in the case of Zayud, where the Supreme Court basically upheld the law that allows the revocation of citizenship for Palestinian citizens based on the breach of alliance or the breach of loyalty category or criteria. And now basically the road is paved not only to revocation of residency, but also to the revocation of citizenship.
Thank you very much, Rabea. And while you were talking about the Israeli Supreme Court and just how the idea that any court system within the Israeli regime can serve Palestinian rights or can somehow operate as a defender of Palestinian rights is almost it is actually counterintuitive, and to recognize that that a so-called passport or citizenship, to see that as somehow different within this regime is part of the problem. So to speak about that, to this notion that, any iteration of any law, how different can they look, and how different are the implications for Palestinians across colonized Palestine, Gaza, 48, West Bank, and the rest of the world? How different can they look, especially now we have the most extreme right-wing government, and this is the way it's been marketed in all the news channels. What are the implications of this new government, if any, for Palestinian issues of residency, citizenship, nationality rights, and so on, given that over the decades this has been orchestrated deliberately? Is there anything that we can expect to change or worsen and so on with this new government? Nada, let's start with you and then move on to Rabea. And feel free to just continue speaking. You don't have to wait for my prompt.
Yeah, thank you for this question. I think this is a very problematic framing that we've been hearing very much by the media, by the international community, that this new government, it's an extreme rights government that is pushing new or dangerous policies and practices and laws, whereas the reality here is that we as Palestinians live under a regime of racial domination and oppression that is an institutionalized regime since the establishment of the State of Israel. So there is no change in the ideology. The ideology that underpins the state is the Zionist ideology. And this ideology at its roots has started with the importance of having transfer as the base for the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. So the Zionist movement, it pursued settler colonialism with an inherently racist ideology and the transfer and the fragmentation of the Palestinian population as foundational prerequisites. These policies have become the driving force behind Israel's apartheid regime. So basically, there is no change in policies, there is no difference. And to go back historically, the Zionist movement realized very quickly it couldn't create a Jewish state in Palestine if it did not transfer Palestinians. So following the UNGA partition plan, the resolution of the UN in 47, where the Jewish population owned less than 7% of the land, the Zionist movement implemented different plans to transfer Palestinians, to ethnically cleanse the land of its Palestinian indigenous population, which led to the Nakba of 48, where we have 80% of the Palestinian people becoming refugees and internally displaced. And this is when Israel decided to start to put what gains it had from this expulsion into law. So it proceeded to install a legal regime that legalized and legitimized the denial of the Palestinian right of return and the disposition of the Palestinian people. So since then, these laws, whether it's the residency laws that were established, it entrenched the apartheid regimes through these laws, policies, and practices that continue till today, most importantly in two domains, the domain of land and the domain of nationality. So not talking about Jerusalem specifically, but against Palestinians as a whole, the foundational laws regarding nationality are, to start with, the law of 1950 of return that grants every Jewish person the exclusive right to enter Israel, whereas Palestinian refugees and internally displaced are categorically denied this right of return to their homes and property. In 52, the law of citizenship cemented Israel's institutionalized regime of racial domination and oppression in law by conferring automatic Israeli citizenship to any Jewish person who enters Israel under this law of 52, while Palestinians are denied this right. But more to that is that Israel makes a difference between a Jewish nationality that is for Jewish persons only, that is superior to the Jewish citizenship that is granted to non-Jews. And these laws have been at the base of what we see today, and these laws and policies have led to the situation we are in today, where these laws empower the Israeli regime to manage and manipulate the demographies in the territory under its control in favor of Jewish settlements and Jewish localities. But what we see is that the transfer of Palestinians and other policies are entrenched within this ideology and the state, and more importantly, that it's not the left or the right that have led different policies, because in 1992, one of the most clear examples is the government of Rabin, which deported more than 400 Palestinians in December 1992 to Lebanon. These are people who were already deported by a government with this ideology that deportation can be used for demographic reasons, but also for as punitive measures. I mentioned that we had many bills that were introduced in the Knesset, and that was at the time when we were doing a lot of research around Jerusalem and these bills that were coming to the Knesset after 2015 and this uprising. Many of them were related to making it easier for the Minister of the Interior to revoke the permanent residency status of families of alleged attackers, as well as deporting Palestinians. Today, we hear more and more about this bill that has been past the first reading, and it speaks also to the fact that Israel is trying to deport, but in law, putting it in law to deport Palestinians once they are out of prison if they have committed an act that is breach of allegiance. But what we see is that this is a continuation of a policy that's very entrenched because of the examples that I mentioned in 1992, or and other examples are the case of Salah. So they did not need the law in order to do that. What we see is that Israel is able to do what it is doing because there is complete impunity at the international level. There is no holding Israel accountable. So as the situation goes on and there are no any kind of effective counter policies to what Israel is doing to Israel's apartheid regime, well, what we will see is only any government that has the capacity to entrench further transfer, fragmentation, and demographic control, it will do so without hesitation.
Rabea, thank you, Nada. The same question to you. What are the implications of a new government?
Well, I'll try to play the devil's advocate and try to push back maybe a little bit, saying that yes, honestly, I agree with everything Nada said. There is no major fundamental difference in the ways that Israeli governments, left or so-called left or right, have treated Palestinians. The foundational understanding was always, let's put it that way. Israel, when it was established by what is considered today to be a left-wing government. The ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948, the military rule that ruled Palestinian citizens of Israel was all conducted under the Labour Party of Israel, right? So obviously it is problematic to think of the current government as a break from an otherwise normal situation. This, I completely agree with this, but I do think that there is few differences between or new dangers that perhaps can occur under the new government, and it is also a difference of legal culture between the so-called left and right, and this is maybe something interesting to note. The 19-year military rule that ruled Palestinian citizens between 1948 to 1966 was not codified in law. You do not have the military rule law declaring, distinctive treatment of Palestinian citizens. In fact, it was done through executive orders, through the court system as well, an interplay between the court and the executive branches. It did not need the legislator to declare it. What we see today, or in the last maybe 20, 30 years, is more a turn to entrench policies by making them official laws and calling them by their name, which is an interesting move. I don't know, what it speaks of in terms of, how the right wing is perhaps trying to codify its policies or declare something to its constituency. But this is exactly what we're seeing in the citizenship revocation, right? I mentioned before the 2021 case of the Supreme Court upholding a previous law that allows revoking citizenship based on breach of loyalty or breach of alliance, right? So there is a law in place that already allows this, and many times people are confused because you suddenly hear the headlines, and I put this in the chat, the new bills trying to basically expand this law. Okay, so there are the law is in place, and the law is a major part of the design of this system, and the Supreme Court, for example, has been fully cooperative with these policies and laws. What we see still under the new government is a push to intensify perhaps the use of these laws, to expand the use of these laws, and basically to add transfer to what otherwise would be just simply a change of legal status. So in the 2021 case that we're talking about, if if the minister decides that you committed a breach of loyalty, which is kind of fluid category, you do not exactly know how this will be interpreted. Does this require, for example, a criminal charge or no? Can you reach the conclusion as a minister to decide to, strip a person from citizenship based on administrative processes without criminal processes? These are all questions that stem from the legal process. Okay, and in general, the answer is no. The breach of loyalty category or criteria is much wider than we think it is, or it's not tailored to criminal trials. In any case, now we have bills by the new government to try to expand this corpus and add not only revocation of citizenship, but also transfer to the West Bank or Gaza of people who are considered within this category of breach of loyalty and who got so-called assistance from the PA for their actions, material assistance. So it's interesting to see how things are shifting. I do definitely think that that certain policies are intensifying under the new government. For example, the house demolitions that we've been just seeing, but the organizing logic of all of this, by the end of the day, goes back to what Nada just said, which is these are internal politics of Israeli society that are performed on Palestinian lives and bodies, right? The victims of these policies are eventually Palestinians, whether it's from the right, whether it's from the left. I think that we as Palestinians or Palestinian society is paying the price of the electoral battles between the left and right in Israel today.
Thank you both for these very thorough answers, covering quite a lot, and we're getting a lot of questions from our audience, and I'd love to get to some of them in the 20 minutes that remain. Nada, if we can start with you. Earlier, in referencing the Salah Hamouri case, you mentioned that it is setting a precedent for what will undoubtedly follow, unfortunately. However, he has attracted a lot of international attention, given that he's a dual citizen of France, and given his status as quite vocal human rights defender. I wanted to ask, what is the place of international law in this demographic engineering? Is it a viable tool through which Palestinians and Palestinian allies can challenge the Israeli regime's policies? And then a similar question about international law to you, Rabea, but let's start with this one.
Yeah, thank you for this question. I couldn't cover a lot that I wanted to cover. That for me, international humanitarian law is a big issue in the question of Palestine. Because if we talk just about international humanitarian law, which is applicable to Jerusalem and to the rest of the occupied territory, it excludes one of the categories that Israel has been fragmenting, which is the Palestinians of 48. It excludes also Palestinian refugees. It excludes half of the Palestinian population to the least. So when the international community came together and decided, okay, one part is occupied, the other is not, we got to this point where we're talking about Salah's case because he's from Jerusalem and he's from occupied Jerusalem, but we're not talking about other cases in the same way. Just to provide an example, Omar Barghouti, who was one of the founders of BDS, one of the ministers of the interior, I forget which one, declared that they would revoke his residency for his role in the BDS movement. Omar Barghouti lives in 48, he lives in Akka, and he holds a residency status based on family unification with his wife, who is a Palestinian of Israel. So in this case, when we as Palestinians come to talk about the case of Omar Barghouti, what we hear is, oh no, international humanitarian law does not apply. So we're dividing, we're fragmenting Palestinians. And this is why, for us, it's very important that we have this apartheid framing that is very helpful to reorganize Palestinians as a unity. It's one people. All these categories that Israel tried to divide and make into different categories of people who cannot meet and group and live together and have a statehood, etc., are, at the end of the day, facing exactly the same policies, the same laws, and the same practices, but under different names. One being military orders, one being civil law, one being, So at the end of the day, this is a very big challenge for IHL. And this is a criticism that was made in the report and that continues to be made by Palestinian civil society. We need to go beyond IHL. And in the case of Salah, of course, IHL is applicable. Of course, this is a crime and it can be considered a crime against humanity if it's done in a widespread and systematic manner, which it is because it's a policy and we know the numbers, etc. But the problem is not law. The problem is political will to act. And this is where we go back to the importance of this shift of narrative to help in reorganizing Palestinian narrative and discourse. And this has created a very important opportunity for us as Palestinians, including in UN spaces, to reorganize as a Palestinian unity. And this is one of the examples of the Commission of Inquiry that was established in the Human Rights Council in 2022, following the 2021, following the Unity Intifada that led to the UN for the first time, the Human Rights Council, recognizing that the policies by Israel against Palestinians are not limited to 67 borders, but are against Palestinians as a whole. And this is why we see limits of IHL, and we're moving beyond this. And the narrative is one of the tools in which we can counter this narrative, but the law cannot be applied without political will.
Thank you very much, Nada. Rabea, let's move to you and stay centered on the question of international humanitarian law. Within the Israeli legal practice, to what extent is demographic engineering a result of military law, or is it more a result of civil law? And then to what extent does Israel use the state of exception doctrine in its policies? And clearly these are breaches of international law. What is happening within the Israeli legal system that allows it to perpetuate these policies, irrespective of international law? Is it some sort of military doctrine? Is it some state of exception doctrine?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I want to echo everything that Nada said in this sense. I absolutely agree, and this speaking also to my work on my dissertation, which is on fragmentation. I absolutely agree on the need to transcend this discourse fragments itself, right? If we accept the whole idea of, partition, right, which was mandated by the UN in 1947, we are starting with the starting point is already problematic because it assumes the partition of the Palestinians or the fragmentation of the Palestinian people into different units, right? And the reality is, or the Palestinian experience is one that transcends this fragmentation. Palestinians have reiterated in many, many different instances, most recently in the May 2021 Unity Uprising, that they imagine themselves as one people, that they want to reiterate their unity, that they see a shared fate for Palestinians, whether citizens of Israel, whether in Gaza, whether in Jerusalem, refugees, or West Bank. So we definitely need to transcend the legal categories that exist to be able to understand what is going on. And I do think that the legal fragmentation, or the description of legal fragmentation, is an important way forward to dismantle or to try to reimagine or transcend or undo fragmentation. Because, I absolutely subscribe and accept the descriptions of apartheid, which is, again, a legal category, the crime of apartheid in international law. But I do think that it is an analogy and it's a crime that we need to fine-tune to the Palestinian experience of, intense legal fragmentation. Usually, as I understand it, apartheid invokes at least imageries of a binary, right? Based on the South African experience, although I know this is not exactly nuanced because there were few also different categories in South Africa, including the colored. But what I'm trying to say is that we do need definitely to think about this idea of legal fragmentation more in order to transcend it. Now, ironically, perhaps, Israel has, in its own way, by occupying the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, reunified in some way Palestinian under its rule, right? And I'm putting this as a question, kind of exclamation mark here, because I do think we need to reflect about what happened here, right? When you have Israel extending or consolidating its regime of legal fragmentation. And this goes back to what you said, because again, the basic idea of demographic engineering or a Jewish state, the self-consciousness of average Israeli, pretty much almost all Israelis, because there is really almost no non-Zionist faction in Israeli society politically. So all of them subscribe to this idea of a Jewish state, right? Which is based or premised on the idea of a Jewish majority, as we said. Therefore, once the Palestinian 1967 occupation happened, right, ruling Gaza, West Bank, East Jerusalem, you have a major population here that Israel cannot extend citizenship to, unlike what it did with 1948, right? Because the Palestinians in 1948, they can be managed as a minoritized problem. And again, I want to use the word minoritized because we are not a minority. We did not, woke up one day and, we're always a minority organically, but we as people have become a minority. We were minoritized in the process of 1948. And so basically the law here is a crucial tool to understand what's happening. And at the same time, it's a tool that not only fragments Palestinians, but by extending Israeli law on Palestinians in the West Bank, in Gaza, in East Jerusalem, it is a different type of law. It's military law in the West Bank and in Gaza. But I want to propose the question to think about, ironically, perhaps Israel is in some way, creating one framework for us to function within, right? And it's kind of ironic because it's counterintuitive to the idea of maintaining or maintaining a fragmented society. And I think this has been floated before. I think Amjad Iraqi, who's also in the Shabaka, wrote a piece about it recently for The Nation. So with that, I want to perhaps end and say something. You mentioned you mentioned the military use of military versus civil, or the exception. Israel has been in a state of exception since its inception. It's one of the long-lasting cases of using the state of exception to normalize certain practices that are considered reserved for military rule. But I don't think that this is the core of it. I mean, yes, sure, this exists, but in fact, Israel is practicing many different, as we said, many different policies. Some of them are military deportations, for example, or house demolitions or whatnot, and the others are under the pretext of regular civil citizenship law, like the family unification or the revocation of citizenship that we're seeing recently.
Thank you, Rabea. Nada, let's go back to you. And a question, as often is the case, the PA and any Palestinian authority or leadership seems to seem less and less relevant when it comes to defending Palestinian rights. So in the context of Israel denaturalizing or let's say kicking or deporting Palestinians from across colonized Palestine, the question here, the reference given was about the case of those deported to Lebanon. Since the PA cannot, in theory, do anything about these things, and Israel automatically registers deported folks as West Bank residents, is there anything that the PA can do at all? Are there any legal mechanisms or political mechanisms that the PA can enforce to protect? I mean, that's a difficult word to use in this context, but to speak on behalf of these Palestinians who are subjected to these demographic engineering policies.
Yeah, it's a tough question because the role of the PA has been problematic in many instances. But on this issue particularly, we have to remember that the PA itself does not have any power over its own registry of the Palestinian population. So at the end of the day, when we're talking about citizenship laws, etc., when the PA was formed, Israel gave it this facade role of registering Palestinians, but at the end of the day, Israel continues to control who can be registered so that no Palestinian can just be registered by the Palestinian authorities. And we have thousands of Palestinians who live under the PA without status and who live, between quotation marks, illegally in Palestine. So these are issues that continue. So it's an issue that exists. For the deportation of Palestinians from Jerusalem or from 48, until now we don't know of, I think, cases from 48, but from Jerusalem we had the 3 members of the parliament and the previous minister of Jerusalem who were deported, who were not deported because it's not outside the occupied territory, but who were forcibly transferred to Ramallah, and who lived there without any kind of papers because the PA does not want to recognize this forcible transfer, so does not provide them with papers, but at the same time, they live without any kind of documentation. They cannot travel, they cannot move, they cannot do anything. This is also the case of Palestinian children who are without any documentation. There are these children born from family unification between a Palestinian from Jerusalem and a Palestinian from elsewhere in the West Bank. If they're not registered and if they cannot prove 1 million documents, including center of life, etc., Israel does not register them and does not provide them with the residency status that they need. These children end up without any kind of papers, and there are estimations, but no clear number, but more than 10,000 children in this situation, 10,000. So the PA does not provide them a status, a Palestinian identity cards, in order not to recognize the illegality of the Israeli situation. But at the end of the day, there are no alternatives. And this kind of deportation and the escalation of this policy needs real countering from the international community, because at the end of the day, the PA in itself, I don't think will be able to handle it or to provide any rights to these Palestinians who had get their residencies revoked.
Thank you, Nada. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I can tell that this is a very lively and engaging conversation. We still have questions coming in, but unfortunately, we have run out of time. So thank you, Nada and Rabea, for sharing your expert insights and experiences on this critical topic. You've made it very clear that Israeli demographic engineering is not a new phenomenon, and it has, in fact, been the Zionist strategy since the start. In this way, any new policies or laws that any new Israeli government puts forth will inevitably serve the same purpose of ethnically cleansing Palestine of Palestinians. The very fact of legally classifying Palestinians differently serves the agenda of fragmenting us in those 4 ways that you outlined for us. And in responding to these demographic engineering policies, it's important to strike that balance between, yes, on the one hand, strategically challenging specific laws that target specific Palestinian communities differently, while also highlighting the larger context of what is Israeli apartheid and ethnic cleansing, under which all of these policies fit. It's a daunting task, especially for those fighting on the front lines, such as yourselves. So ya'atikum alf afiyah, and thank you for all that you do and for taking the time to be with us this evening. Also like to thank our audience all over the world for attending this lab and for submitting your very thoughtful and engaging questions and comments. I'm sorry that I could not address all of them. Before we sign off, as always, I'd like to remind everyone that Policy Labs are a crowd-funded program of Al-Shabaka, so we do rely on your continued support. If you are able to donate, please do so by clicking on the donate link that should now appear on your screens. Thank you again to everyone, and thank you, Rabea and Nada, and good night.
Thank you.